News of the Times. Murder on the Winter Road. A Christmas killing in Ballinrobe in 1883. Ballinrobe, County Mayo, December 1880. A time when Christmas preparations in rural Ireland meant market days, neighbours gathering for provisions, and families travelling the long rutted roads that wound between scattered tenant cottages. But on one bitter winter's evening, as frost settled across the boreens and the last light slipped behind the stone walls, an ordinary walk home suddenly took a deadly turn. Before the night was out, a man would be found lying in the road, dying in the snow. And yet the hours before his death were stranger still. The victim had stormed into the house where his wife had taken refuge, raging and demanding her return. The woman of that house sprinkled him with holy water as he searched for his wife, a gesture that later raised more than a few eyebrows. His wife fled into the night. The victim and his son followed after, and the path they took led them directly toward the place where the attackers lay in wait. According to the son, the men who leapt from the ditch were over 6 feet tall and unbearded, an unlikely detail in the pitch dark of an Irish winter, and rarer still amongst rural labourers of the time. 2 nephews well known to the son would later fall under suspicion. A mother, a son, 2 nephews and a neighbour, each with their own story, each with their own omissions. Was this misfortune on a frozen December road? Or did several people quietly and deliberately help steer a violent man to his death? And in today's end of segment further particular story, a brief detour to Derbyshire, where a local vicar once caused such a commotion with a horse, a crowd, and a bread knife that the entire village ended up at the magistrate's court. A small reminder that clergy too occasionally have spirited days. So settle in, pour yourself something warm, and join us as we step back into a dark December in Ballinrobe and examine a killing that may have been far less random than anyone at the time dared to admit. Life in Ballinrobe, County Mayo in 1880. In 1880, Ballinrobe stood at the heart of a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving, a patchwork of small tenant farms scattered across the boglands and stony fields of County Mayo. Life for most families here followed a rhythm as old as the land itself. Long days of labour, poor soil that gave little in return, and a constant gnawing awareness that the farm was not truly theirs. To be a tenant farmer meant working land owned by another, and landlord who might live in Dublin, London, or even never set foot in Mayo at all. Rents were often high, harvests unreliable, and arrears could mean eviction with little warning. A single bad season could sink an entire family. A harsh winter could be catastrophic. It was a world ruled by obligation, deference, and fear, where the social order felt rigid and the margins of survival perilously thin. And against this backdrop, simmering beneath daily life, lay the ever-present spectre of agrarian violence. When the pressure of rents, tithes, and disputes over the land grew intolerable, some communities, or fractions within them, resorted to what newspapers termed agrarian outrages, shootings, beatings, or intimidations carried out under the cover of darkness. These killings were rarely random. They were warnings, reprisals, or rough attempts at enforcing local justice where official law felt distant or ineffective. In such cases, it was not always clear who had pulled the trigger, but almost everyone understood why it had been pulled. Within this tense world, Christmas brought one of the few breaks in the year's relentless struggle. In the weeks leading up to the holiday, rural families made the long walk or cart ride into market towns like Ballinrobe, journeys taken along narrow, frost-slicked boreens with lanterns swinging from traps or carried by hand. These markets were more than shopping trips, they were social gatherings, a chance to see neighbours, exchange gossip, buy provisions, and feel, if only briefly, part of something larger than the scattered cottages of the countryside. The air filled with the bustle of buying flour, candles, cloth, boots, ribbons, and the small luxuries a family might permit themselves at Christmas time. Good humour ran high, pockets strained with the last of the year's earnings, and friendships were renewed in the glow of the season. But as this particular December of 1880 unfolded, not every traveller headed home from the market would return safely. And on one darkened road outside Ballinrobe, Christmas goodwill gave way to something far colder. After a day of Christmas merriment in Ballinrobe, the shopping, the greetings, the drinks shared in the warmth of a local public house, Peter Mullen and his wife Judy and their 16-year-old son Patrick joined neighbours from their district to raise a final glass before the long road home. By all accounts, Peter had taken drink enough to soften his step, but not to be unsteady. He was described as cheerful, even pleasant, though those who knew the family suspected that his wife may not have shared the jovial mood. Judy, it seemed, had little appetite for continuing the evening under her husband's increasingly boisterous spirits. As the clock edged towards 10, the decision was made to leave for home. By the time they left the lights of Ballinrobe behind, the small party was separated. The night was bitter, and the route home, a lonely boreen flanked by ditches and stone walls, was a place where voices carried, tempers rose, and danger could wait unseen. Patrick Mullen and his son walking in front of the others, only to realise later that Judy Mullen had decided to stay with one of the friends along the way rather than go home. And thus the scene was set for what would become a murderous evening. From the Dublin Evening Telegraph, the 23rd of December, 1880, the murder near Ballinrobe. Much mystery hangs around the murder of Peter Mullen, which was perpetrated on Monday night last in a bleak and lonely place. The one thing that seems certain is that it is not agrarian, at all events in the ordinary sense of the word. Mullen was a small farmer holding about 14 acres of land under Captain Knox of Ballinrobe, the rent of which was £10 a year. He was about 60 years of age, under the middle height, and when murdered wore a frieze coat and corduroy trousers. His wife, Judy Mullen, about the same age as himself, and his son, a lad of 16, lived with him. He had gone to England about 2 years ago and only returned 4 or 5 months ago. There doesn't appear to be any foundation for the rumour which gained currency for a time that he had been murdered because he had paid his rent. Even if he had rendered himself obnoxious by doing so, it seems scarcely likely that he could be selected as an example. He occupied too insignificant a position, one would say, to have attracted notice on that account. Scarcely less acceptable, however, is the mode of accounting for it by the existence of domestic differences. It is quite true that he and his wife did not live happily together, and that there were frequent squabbles between them. Even on the night of the murder they had a somewhat serious quarrel, but making the utmost possible allowance for all of this, it is difficult to believe that a murder such as the one present, and committed after the fashion in which it was committed, is the result of domestic quarrels. So far as appears at present, the deed was not the work of his wife, nor by whomever committed was it done in a fit of passion. The man was murdered, or it should be rather said, assassinated, by two men who seem to have been lying in wait for him, and who, whether they mistook their man or not, and there is a reason to suppose that they did, at all events must have been bent on taking the life of a frieze-coated peasant farmer. The assassins, according to the story of Mullen's son, were seated upon the raised ditch at the side of the road, within at most 3 yards of Mullen as he passed, and they went between him and his son, and going close up to him, fired in succession 4 or 5 shots, 4 of which at least took effect, 1 in the back of the neck and 3 in other parts of the head. According to inquiries, Peter Mullen, his wife Judy, and their son had spent the Monday in Ballinrobe for market day, drinking with many others until they were turned out of the public house at closing time at around 10 o'clock. The family set off home with neighbours, but the husband and his son took one road, while Judy chose another. After waiting some time at home, Peter refused to eat until his wife returned, and so he and his son set out again, this time to the house of the Boreen family, where Judy had taken refuge. There a quarrel broke out, sharp words followed by blows, and in this scuffle Peter tore the cap from his wife's head before father and son left once more into the night. Father and son then left and proceeded back towards their house, leaving Mrs. Mullen in Boreen's place. They proceeded homewards by a different route from that by which they had come, and the circumstances adds to the mystery surrounding the whole affair, for it is difficult to understand how his assailants came to be in wait for him at the place where the murder was committed. It was just as likely, and indeed more likely, that he would return by the way he had come, in which case he would not have had to pass the spot where his intending murderers were in wait. This was in a narrow road, or boreen, and only about 120 yards from the main road, which, however, is one very little frequented. In fact, for a considerable length at this point, it passes through a bog. The man fell on the first shot being fired, falling forward on his face and seemingly never subsequently making any movement. The body was allowed to lie from the time of the occurrence on Monday night on the spot where it fell and until 2 o'clock today, Wednesday, when the inquest having been formally opened and the body identified by the deceased's son, it was removed to the house in which he had resided. A post-mortem examination having been made, the coroner gave permission for the remains to be buried. The body represented a sad spectacle as it lay on the open road, covered merely with an old sack. The deceased man had fallen straight forwards onto his face, his hands lying by his side, the back of the hands on the ground, and the fingers clenched convulsively. On examining, it was found that the deceased had, as already stated, received 4 bullets, any one of the wounds being sufficient to cause death. It appears that young Mullen, on the occurrence of the tragedy, proceeded immediately to Ballinrobe to inform the police, and several members of the force under Sub-Inspector McArdle arrived shortly after midnight. As the result of inquiry, they proceeded to Boreen's house. Here they were first informed that nobody had been there that night, but on closer questioning, it was admitted that Mullen had been there. The house was then searched, and Mrs. Mullen was found concealed under a bed. She was at once taken into custody and removed to Ballinrobe, Bridewell. This was about 3 o'clock in the morning. 4 hours later, the police arrested two men in their own houses, both of which are in the neighbourhood of the murder. These were Patrick Fiorick, aged 27, and Anthony Sheridan, nephew of the female prisoner. The three prisoners were afterwards taken before Mr. McSheeby and on application were remanded for a week and conveyed to the county jail at Castlebar. The coroner, Mr. Rutledge, arrived at Kilthorne that afternoon and formally opened the inquest. A jury of 23 was sworn in, and together with the coroner, Dr. Kelly, and the police, walked to the roadside where Peter Mullen's body still lay. After the formal viewing, the victim's son Patrick was taken to identify his father, back in the small thatched cabin serving as the inquest room. He confirmed the remains as those of Peter Mullen. With the identification complete and daylight fading, the coroner adjourned proceedings for a post-mortem to be carried out, noting that neither he nor the far-travelled jurors wished to be abroad on the dark winter roads any longer than necessary. The shock in Ballinrobe was immediate and profound. A man had been gunned down on a lonely winter road, not in a tavern brawl or a moment of passion, but by two figures lying in deliberate wait on a path he was not expected to take. The strangeness of it unsettled the entire district. How had the attackers known his route? Why had he passed that way at all? And why did his own son's account raise more questions than it answered? When word spread that the police had arrested his wife and two of her nephews, the sense of bewilderment deepened. Neighbours whispered in doorways, rumours travelled faster than the constables. A quarrel, a separation on the road, a diversion through a friend's cottage. Could such domestic turbulence truly end in assassination? By the time the inquest was opened, the village was alight with speculation. Every household wanted answers, and as the coroner and jurymen assembled in the cramped lamplit cottage where the hearing began, it was clear that this was no ordinary killing, but a mystery that had shaken Ballinrobe to its core. As the inquest began and the finer details filtered through the community, one detail in particularly unsettled them. Mrs. Careen, the friend of whom Judy Mullen had taken refuge, admitted to sprinkling Peter Mullen with holy water when he forced his way into her house earlier that night. It was, on the face of it, an act of simple Catholic charity. And yet, in the cold aftermath of the murder, villagers could not help wondering, was she offering comfort to a distressed man, or preparing him for a fate that she already knew awaited him on the road outside? From the Irish Times, the 24th of December, 1880. Murder in Mayo. The inquest. The adjourned inquest on the body of Peter Mullen, who was on Monday night last at a place called Kiltrone near Ballinrobe, was held here today. Patrick Mullen, a lad of about 16 years of age, was examined and deposed that the deceased was his father, and that on Monday last, being market day, he went into Ballinrobe, where later in the day he met his father and mother. During the day, they, with other friends, were drinking in Fiorick's public house. At about 10 o'clock, they, accompanied by Michael Careen, his wife and two sons, set out for home. Witness and his father walked faster than the others and reached home first. On arriving there, supper was prepared for the deceased, but he refused to eat it and insisted on going out to look for his wife. Witness followed him to Correen's house and waited outside. Finding after some time that his father was not coming out, he went in and saw him sitting on a chair in an excited state. Witness continued, his hat was off and Mrs. Correen had a bottle which she was sprinkling on his head. I think it was holy water that was in the bottle. I asked him what was the matter, and he said nothing, and he added that my mother would not come home and that he did not know where she was. I was afraid that he would beat her, and I told the Correens to save her. He then left the house, and I went after him, and he went out without his hat. I went along with him. We went toward the main road, and I followed him, walking 5 or 6 yards behind. When we came to the boreen where he was killed, I saw 2 men sitting on the ditch on the left-hand side of the boreen. As soon as my father passed, they stood up. One of them looked up at me, and one of them drew something from his pocket which shone in the moonlight and fired at my father, who at once fell. I ran away, shouting and screaming, and while I was running down the boreen towards the main road, I heard 5 other shots fired. I ran to Correen's house, met the daughter at the door, and at the same moment saw the 2 men jumping over the ditch and running away across the fields in the direction of a wood. I then went into the house and said my father was murdered. They sat me down in a chair, but I ran out and went along until I met the police and told them what had happened. I did not think I ever saw the 2 men before, but I would know them again if I saw them. I never in my life saw the kind of thing the man pulled out of his pockets when my father was shot. The boy, on being asked to repeat some of his evidence again, made the extraordinary statement that when he first went into Correen's house, he found that Mrs. Correen had been something which he believed to be holy water upon his father's bare head. He also stated that the men, when the first shot was fired, were only about a yard behind his father and about 4 yards from himself. Sub-Inspector McArdle, with witness and several more police, went out to the place and found Mullen lying in the burrow, face downwards, quite dead. The medical evidence. Dr. Hanrahan testified that he and Dr. Kelly had conducted the post-mortem on Peter Mullen. They found 5 gunshot wounds in total, 4 to the head and 1 to the neck. The first bullet, fired from behind the left ear, travelled straight through the centre of the brain and lodged in the frontal bone. This shot alone would have caused instant death. A second bullet had entered the neck near the spinal column. It could not be located. The remaining 3 bullets had entered from the right rear of the skull. In the doctor's opinion, the deceased fell immediately after the first shot, and the additional shots were fired while he lay on the ground. With the medical testimony complete, the coroner instructed the jury to withdraw and determine the cause of death. It was, he noted, a straightforward question how Peter Mullen had died, if not by whose hand. The jury returned quickly with their verdict. Peter Mullen, they found, had died from gunshot wounds inflicted on the night of the 20th and 21st of December, 1880. There was no evidence identifying the killers, only that the crime was deliberate. In formal terms, willful murder by person or persons unknown. But if the inquest offered clarity on how Peter Mullen died, it shed no light at all on who had killed him, and the village was hungry for answers. Whispers ran ahead of the authorities, and soon an uneasy picture began to take shape. Peter Mullen had only recently returned from England after several years away, and by every local account to his homecoming had not softened him. His marriage to Judy was known to be quarrelsome at the best of times and violent at the worst. Neighbours had long sympathised with Judy and her 16-year-old son Patrick, who said to worry constantly about the beatings that she endured. On the night of the murder, Judy had taken refuge in the house of a neighbour, Mrs. Corrine. When Peter arrived there, angry, drunk, and demanding his wife, a struggle followed in which Judy was struck. Mrs. Corrine's response was unusual enough to be remembered. She sprinkled Peter with holy water as Judy fled into the darkness. What happened next deepened suspicion. Instead of returning home by the usual road, young Patrick led his father along a different, lonelier path, the very one where the attackers were waiting. And then there was his description of the killers: 2 men over 6 feet tall, clean-shaven, leaping from a ditch after midnight on an unlit road. A strange claim, given that his own cousins, short, bearded, and well known to him, would soon be arrested. It was enough to give the authorities serious doubts. But could any of it be proven in court? With the arrests made and the community on edge, the case moved to the magistrates, and the question of whether anyone would stand trial for a Christmas killing that felt far from random. From the Freeman's Journal, the 31st of December, 1880. The murder near Ballinrobe. Acquittal of the prisoners. Today the prisoners Anthony Sheridan and Patrick Ferrick and Judy Mullen, charged with being concerned with the murder of Peter Mullen at Courtroom on the night of the 20th, were brought up on remand at Holy Mount. The village was crowded with people from the vicinity of the scene of the murder before the inquiry had begun. Patrick Mullen, the victim's son and the only eyewitness to the attack, was the first examined. His account was long and wandering, but the key points emerged clearly enough. Patrick stated that he went into Ballinrobe alone around midday. On the road home, he met his parents heading toward the town, and his father insisted he turn back with them. For the rest of the afternoon and evening, the family moved between several public houses, meeting various neighbours, drinking whiskey, and passing the hours until 10 o'clock closing. Throughout the evening, Patrick claimed to have seen the 2 accused men, his cousins Ferrick and Sheridan, briefly in Ferrick's public house, but not drinking with his father. He insisted they were not present when he, his father and mother, left at closing time with a larger group of local families. He further stated that he did not see his cousins again after the early evening, nor did he notice them on the road as the party dispersed. Patrick stated that when the public house closed at 10, his father had enough taken, but was not staggering, and the family joined the others heading out of Ballinrobe. They walked together as far as the Ball Alley before the group dispersed, and Patrick and his father pressed on alone, saying they walked quickly because his feet were cold. They reached their cottage around 11 o'clock. Patrick's sister set out supper, but his father refused to eat until his wife returned. Instead, he put his coat back on and walked straight to the house of the Corrines, where Judy was known to seek refuge during quarrels. Patrick followed and found the scene inside unusually tense. Mrs. Corrine stood holding a bottle of holy water, and his father, sprinkled across the head, was sitting on a stool, searching the room and demanding to know where Judy had gone. Someone suggested she might have slipped off to another neighbour's house, and Patrick told his father perhaps she did, before they both left the Corrine home and set out again into the darkness. Patrick continued. His father then started for Gronell's, about 6 yards in advance of him. When leaving the main road and entering the boreen to Gronell's house, he observed 2 men at the ditch on the left-hand side of the boreen. and when his father had passed them by about 1 yard, both men followed him. One of the men turned and looked hard at the witness, and then took from his coat something very bright, and put it on the back of his father's head, and then he heard the report of a shot, and he saw his father fall. Witness ran away, and looking back he saw both men over his father firing shots at him as he lay on the ground. Witness shouted and ran on to the main road. When passing Curran's house, he saw Curran's family at the gable. They brought him in and put him sitting on a chair, but he got up at once and ran into Ballinrobe and gave information to the police, a number of whom accompanied him to the scene of the murder. He knew Anthony Sheridan and Pat Ferrick, the prisoners. They did not shoot my father. The men who shot my father were about 6 feet high and wore no beards or moustaches. Head Constable McArdle deposed that the last witness came to Ballinrobe Barrack at about 15 minutes to 1 a.m. on the 21st. In consequence of what he told, McArdle and 8 of the police went with young Mullen to where the man was murdered. They saw the deceased lying on his face in the boreen with his feet crossed. His brains were protruding and a portion of them were scattered on the ground. Witness stated that the body had been left lying there from the night of the murder, Monday the 21st, until 2 p.m. on the Wednesday following. With Judy Mullen unable to testify, she spoke no English, and no interpreter had been provided. The court instead turned to the only other person who had witnessed the changed and charged scene inside the Corrine household that night. Mrs. Corrine, the neighbour who had sheltered Judy from her husband's temper, was called to the stand to recount what had taken place within her walls in those crucial moments before the murder. Her testimony, quiet but unsettling, would offer the court its clearest glimpse into the mounting tensions and strange behaviour that preceded the fatal walk into the darkness. Mary Curran deposed that she lived at Kiltrone. She left Ballinrobe for home at 10 p.m. on the night of the 21st. On reaching the house, she saw a woman standing at the gable of the house, whom she took to be her mother. The woman replied, "I am Judy Mullen. For God's sake, give me shelter until morning. Then I will go to the priest at Robin." They both went into the house. In about 15 minutes after she heard the knocking at the door, she asked, "Who is there?" And a voice answered, "Peter Mullen," and asked, "Are there any strangers there?" Witness said yes, and opened the door. "Where is she?" said he. "I am here," said his wife. She was sitting at the fire. He then struck her 2 blows with his fist, took her by the hair of the head, and pulled her about the floor. He also tried to dance on top of her. Witness continued, "We tried to make peace. Patrick Mullen saw that happen. He shouted out not to allow his father to kill his mother. She got up and went behind me to another room. Myself and my mother put Peter Mullen, the deceased, sitting on a chair. My mother took a bottle of holy water and shook it upon him. The deceased said his wife was in the room, and I shoved between him and the light so that she could pass into the street without him seeing her. The deceased felt the door open, and then he said his wife had gone out. The deceased and his son then left our house. At about 15 minutes after, Patrick Mullen returned to our house, and my mother and myself heard him shouting. We asked him what was the matter. He said his father was shot. Sub-Constable Kelly deposed that he had found Judy Mullen concealed under a bed in the Corrine's house. In the end, the Crown could take the case no further. Mr. Fitzsimmons formally closed the evidence, and Mr. McShane rose to state that what had become increasingly obvious, there was simply nothing concrete to bind any of the accused to the killing. No witness, no weapon, no clear motive that could safely be laid before a magistrate. What they had instead were troubling impressions, the contradictions in a young boy's account, the bitter domestic quarrels, and the unsettling sequence of events in the hours before the murder. But impressions were not evidence, and so, with regret for what he called a cruel and an Irish murder, Mr. McShane advised that the proceedings could not continue. The case, for all its shadows and suspicions, collapsed for want of proof. Judy Mullen, Patrick Fenwick, and Anthony Sheridan were discharged and liberated from custody. And so the murder of Peter Mullen slipped slowly and quietly into the long list of rural Irish killings that would never see a courtroom verdict. With no evidence strong enough to bind any of the accused to the crime, the magistrates released the prisoners. Judy Mullen returned to her life. Her son resumed his work. The nephews faded back into the countryside, and Mrs. Corrine continued tending her small household. No further arrests were made. No new witnesses came forward, and the questions that hung over that December night were left to the gossip of hearth fires rather than the judgment of a court. In Ballinrobe, life resumed its rhythm. Market days, muddy roads, hard winters, and the same quiet endurance that had always marked the community. But the boreen where Peter Mullen fell remained a place spoken of in lowered voices, especially in the weeks before Christmas, when the story was most often retold. Whether the killers mistook their man, or whether someone in that small circle knew far more than they ever dared say, the truth travelled no further than the snow that covered his body. And like so many tragedies of Tennant Island, the case hardened into silence. A life ended, a family forever altered, and a murder that passed into local memory without ever yielding its secrets. Further particulars. And now for something rather different. A reminder that not all dramatic turns in Victorian life involved shadowy boreens or family plots. Some involved vicar, a bread knife, and an evening that went downhill with remarkable speed. From the Manchester Times, the 5th of October, 1889, charge against the Vicar of Charlesworth. At the Glossop Town Hall on Wednesday afternoon, the adjourned hearing of the case in which the Reverend G. Collins, Vicar of St. John's, Charlesworth, was charged with having been drunk and disorderly on the 30th of August, took place before Mr. James Sidebottom and Captain Partington. The evidence for the prosecution was to the effect that at about 9 o'clock on the date named, the defendant drove into Charlesworth from Glossop and stopped at the George and Dragon Inn, which is about 100 yards from the vicarage. In short time he came out of the inn and led the horse and trap down to the vicarage. There was a disturbance going on in the village, but the defendant was not molested in any way. The defendant left his horse and trap at the vicarage, went into the house, returning a few minutes with a formidable bread knife in his hand. In passing along the street, he brandished the weapon and threatened what he would do. The defendant went a second time to the George and Dragon Inn, and when he came out was exceedingly violent, went down the street, and again brandishing the knife dangerously near the people in a very threatening attitude. When the defendant got within his own grounds, stones were thrown at him, one of which struck the horse over the left eye, while others struck the trap. Unfortunately, the defendant became very excited, took out a knife, and went through the streets with it in his hand, but that was simply to frighten the crowd from breaking his windows, which they had done on previous occasions. The defendant was naturally an excitable subject. It had been admitted that the defendant took a walk around the church an hour and a half after the alleged misconduct in company with his manservant and Constable Brown, and he was able to walk perfectly steadily. Samuel Olberston, groom, was examined and said he was positive that the defendant was perfectly sober on the night in question, but very much excited. The defendant, in his evidence, said when he drove into Charlesworth, he observed a large number of people opposite the George and Dragon Inn, and on pulling up in front of the house, inquired the reason, but received no reply. He then went into the inn and called for a glass of beer, but only supped about half a wine glassful and sent for his manservant. He afterwards took the horse and trap down to the vicarage, and on going down the street he was hooted, and when he entered the vicarage grounds, stones and sods were thrown at him. After giving the horse and trap to his manservant, he went into the house, lit the lamp, took up a bread knife, and went up the street through the people with it in his hand. He had an object in doing that, namely to frighten the people away. When the police officer took the bread knife from him, he did not take a penknife from his pocket and say, "Would it do with that?" Since the adjournment, he had been ill in bed and had not thought it necessary to get any witnesses except his own servants. After a very few minutes' deliberation in private, the chairman said the bench considered the case proved and they should impose a fine of 20 shillings and costs, and also allow the 9 witnesses 25 shillings. The courtroom was crowded during the hearing, while the street in front of the town hall was thronged with people unable to gain admission. The defendant and his witnesses, on leaving the courtroom, were hooted by the crowd, and it was feared at one time that the defendant would be molested. He had to be escorted to a neighbouring hotel by the police. And that brings us to the end of today's darker than intended December stroll through Ballinrobe. If you enjoyed the journey, or at least didn't get ambushed in a ditch along the way, do remember to like, subscribe and share the episode with that friend who insists their family gatherings are complicated. They feel much better after this one. And if you're feeling especially supportive, a small hype on the video helps more than you'd ever believe. Apparently, it's the digital equivalent of 10 gold stars and half a freeze coat. If you'd like to join us on Patreon, we would be delighted to have you. It's low cost, ad-free, and gives you early access to all the episodes, our full archive, and all the extras we can squeeze in without frightening the algorithm. News of the Times, historical crime at patreon.com. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, part-time bog inspector, aspiring boreen cartographer, and seasonal connoisseur of holy water etiquette. And if you're the last one out, do be sure to wipe your feet. You've tracked half of County Mayo across the carpet. Until next time, same News of the Time and the same News of the Time channel.